in my world, political science, social science, putting on my noodlehead academic hat for a minute and taking off my ambassadorial hat, you can't use those variables, right, those causal variables, to explain our current conflict without explaining that interregnum of cooperation, because that doesn't work that way. That means to me that there had to be some more proximate variables, proximate forces that caused the conflict. And that's what I want to end on. I'm going to mention two. And they have to do with Russian domestic politics, not US-Russian relations. Two big events. One, in September 2011, Vladimir Putin decided to run for president again. And you may think, well, what's the big deal? He's the prime minister, he's been in charge, and actually I went in to brief the president a couple of days later, and that was my first line to him. Well, it's regrettable that your partner, Medvedev, is stepping aside, because the president really did get to know Medvedev, and they had a good working relationship. But I said, Mr. President, Putin's been behind all these things we just did. We got to look to cooperate. And the president turned to me and he said, you're right, but you also know this is going to get a lot harder. Putin has a different worldview. And he was right. And I think you would be surprised how different those two gentlemen's worldview are. I sat with them for 5 years. They think about the world very differently. And just to be quick on Putin, he sees the world not in win-win outcomes, like Medvedev does, but in zero-sum terms. +2 for America, that means -2 for Russia. He thinks of the United States as a competitor, not a partner. We can cooperate sometimes, but we're basically competitors. And most importantly, and I think this is the essence of our conflict today, he has a theory about American power, that we use overt and covert power to overthrow regimes that we don't like. And guess what? There's a lot of empirical data to support Putin's hypothesis about American foreign policy over the last 70 years. There is. And in fact, in July 2009, and in this very fancy breakfast, I think actually the caviar was illegal that we were eating, but we sat with Prime Minister Putin out at his dacha, and we debated this. We went through, and he was ready. This is his first meeting with Obama. He spent about 55, maybe an hour, telling him about all the mistakes of the Bush administration. And he went through them all, by the way. It was a long list. He kind of didn't criticize President Bush, by the way. He likes the president. It was the president's administration, the deep state, as we now talk about it. And he does believe there's a deep state in America. CIA, the Pentagon, it's kind of how his system works, right? So he thinks ours works that way. So he went on and on and on. He went about all these mistakes we made, and then he got to Iraq, and he said, you Americans, you're so stupid about, he didn't say stupid. I'm realizing we're being taped. I know you didn't say that, Mr. President, but he did say, you guys are naive about the Middle East. You don't understand. You know, you opened up all this stuff in the Middle East. I want reform too, but you need a strong man to lead reform because society is backwards, right? I think he was kind of thinking about himself when he was saying that. And the president was listening to him. President Obama's a good listener, much better than I. He sat through all this and listened closely. And when we got to Iraq, he said, you're right. You're right about Iraq. And Putin's like, what? You're the Americans. What? You can't take my side. And he's like, well, you may not know this, Mr. Prime Minister, but I was against the war in Iraq long before it was popular to be against the war in Iraq. And that made an impression on Putin. I was watching him. I was sitting there. I was the note taker in this meeting. And as we walked out to the cars to say goodbye, we were 3 hours late, speaking at the New Economic School. Were you there, Rich? No? I was at the next meeting. Yeah, we were making people wait for 3 hours for Obama to show up. Because of Putin, not because of Obama, just for the record. I kind of got the sense that Putin thought, well, okay, maybe this guy is different, right? He most certainly speaks differently, he talks differently, he looks differently, and I got the sense he was like, okay, go work with Medvedev, knock yourself out, maybe we'll get things rolling. But 2 years later, in Putin's view, I want to emphasize, not my view, we confirmed his hypothesis about American power. That's the year that the Arab Spring started, right? Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Libya, in all those places, There were mass uprisings. They were all peaceful back then. People forget. We did not cause any of those events. I was at the White House at the time. We reacted to those events just like the rest of the world. But that was not Putin's view. Putin thought that we were doing regime change, just like we Americans always do, confirming his hypothesis about us. And in particular, Libya, I think, was the beginning of the end of the reset, as I write about in my book. Because on Libya, in one way, was the most cooperative moment in US-Russian relations ever. We went to Moscow with the vice president. I was there, met with Medvedev in the Kremlin. Medvedev chased out everybody in the room, except one note taker and myself. He didn't want Lavrov to be there. I know this for a fact, in retrospect. And that's when he said, you guys are right about the Arab Spring. These were decaying autocracies, and I am going to support you in the use of military force in Libya. And by abstaining on 2 UN Security Council resolutions, he did that. I remember I was taking notes. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that we were going to do this, that he was going to support us on that. Never in the history of Russia or the Soviet Union at the United Nations have they supported the use of force inside a sovereign country. He said, I'm going to go with you on that. And 2 days later, after that resolution passed, Putin criticized him publicly for the first time ever, I think. He said Medvedev made a critical mistake by allowing the crusaders, that's the word Putin used, to go back into Libya. Because he had a different theory about what was going on. And then, to punctuate it all, the end of 2011, right? That's the Arab Spring. It's going on all over the world. And then in December 2011, massive demonstrations occur inside Russia. Falsified election, documented with using smartphones on Vkontakte, Twitter and Facebook. First 50, 500, 200, thousands, and eventually a couple 100,000 people took to the streets of Moscow to first protest the election, but then to say, maybe it's time for Russia without Putin. That was one of their phrases. The last time that many people had assembled on the streets of Moscow was 20 years earlier, 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed, an event that Vladimir Putin called the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. I was there. I was at some of those meetings. And believe me, Putin knows that I was there. Part of my problem later. So when that was happening, for him, I mean, first he was just upset at these people. Like, he had made them rich. They're called the creative class, right? And now they were defecting on him. But his second reaction was fear, because of what was happening before and what had happened in his country. And so that's when he pivoted to a new argument. Remember, he's running for president, for re-election at this time. I forgot to mention that. And that new argument was, these people on the streets of Moscow, they're being funded by the West. They're being supported by the United States. They're being supported by Obama. They are traitors, and we need to control them. And he said that. I want to make sure you know that he said this before I became ambassador. And causation and correlation are not the same thing. We teach that at Stanford. But let me just read you a quote from 2011, November 2011, that Putin said. He said, "We know regrettably that some representatives of some foreign states are gathering those to whom they are paying money, so-called grant recipients, carrying out instructions sessions with them and preparing them to do the relevant work in order to influence, ultimately, election campaign process in our country." And then, that's before the demonstrations. And then when they happened, he pivoted hard to that story. And that's right when I landed as the US ambassador. One of my friends who worked for him on the campaign. All campaign consultants are cynical people that just want to win elections, including in Russia. And when I showed up, this is somebody I'd known for 3 decades. He was like, "Mike, it is so great you are here. You are like manna from heaven for our campaign. Because you believe in all this democracy stuff, we're going to run hard at you. We're going to say that Obama sent you here to overthrow the government, and Navalny, the opposition leader, he's your pet, and you're running that." He said, "Don't take it personally. But this is the game plan we had to do." And so that was my fate, where literally almost every week, sometimes every day, that's the way I was portrayed. You've heard a lot about disinformation these days. Well, I experienced it about me, making it look like I was handing out money to the opposition, scary videos saying, that I was sent there to do regime change. And then sometimes it got really nasty and ugly. The worst, without question, was in February 2012, so I've only been there 3 weeks. A video started circulating suggesting I was a pedophile. And how do you deal with that? Like, what do you say? You get on Twitter and say, I'm not a pedophile? That's how disinformation works, right? I even just mentioning now, I feel kind of weird about it, right? Because I hope you're not thinking, oh, maybe, but it's a weird word. It's a weird accusation, by the way, used frequently in this disinformation stuff. And when you get in an argument about it, it's weird. So we initially didn't respond to it. It was on YouTube, and I had friends at Google, and Google graciously took it down. But then it appeared on other websites. And to this day, if you go on to Yandex, their main search engine, U.S. Ambassador McFaul is a pedophile. I'm reading from the video here. You'll get 4 million hits. And so that's the conflict we were in because of this pivot against us. And by the way, it wasn't just me. Barack Obama also featured prominently. In particular, he was often compared to, very famously, I remember this one video by Kisilov, if you know his show, where he compared Obama to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. When this commentator said, you may not think at first that the President of the United States and the leader of ISIS shares the same worldview, but if you dig deeper, Barack Hussein Obama actually has the same worldview as ISIS. And no amount of diplomacy, no amount of talking was ever going to overcome that. And to this day, that's his view.